Hello, this session looks at comparing the TSC Hong Kong edition to the NEC4 TSC. So we're going to look at the key differences between these two contracts. In looking at the differences and logically work through the contract, the core clauses, the dispute clauses and secondary option clauses, and in particular we're going to focus on one of the enhancements within the TSC Hong Kong edition around the task order provisions. Why have we produced a Hong Kong edition? So this edition of the TSC has been produced to better reflect the local legislation and procurement practices used in the public sector in Hong Kong, and hence why there's some differences and changes, for example, particularly with regard to dispute resolution in the contract from the standard NEC4 TSC. In creating this edition, we have reviewed the Development Bureau's standard ACC and standard amendments, and where possible, included those into the contract, incorporated them into the Hong Kong edition, or moved them into the Development Bureau's generic scope document. Some ACCs are still retained as standard Development Bureau Z clauses. As a reminder, the NEC suite of contracts is a family of contracts that seek to promote a greater stimulus in good project management. It's a very flexible set of contracts designed to be used in a wide variety of commercial situations and uses language and structure that is straightforward and easy to understand. In terms of the TSC Hong Kong edition, the structure of the contract, the parts of the contract, hasn't changed from the standard NEC4 TSC. So we still have contract data. There's been some changes in contract data in terms of entries. We'll talk about that later. We have the conditions of contract, and that's modular based between the core clauses, main option clause, dispute resolution clause, secondary option clauses, schedule of cost components and short schedule. And you choose those option clauses to suit your contract strategy. So nothing really has changed there in terms of how the overall contract works. But of course, there's been some changes within each of those modules, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute. We still have pricing documents, so that's the price list. And we have scope, and that's split between the client scope and the scope provided by the contractor for its plan. And just as a reminder, contract data, the purpose of that document is to provide project-specific information. For example, who the client is, who the contractor is, who the service manager is, and other specific data required for your particular contract. And of course, it also tells you what modules you've put together to create the conditions of contract, points you to the scope document, points you to the pricing information. The scope document, or perhaps collection of documents, hasn't changed in terms of what it is, in terms of the Hong Kong edition. It's still there to specify and describe the services and state any constraints on how the contractor provides the service. And the price list still has the same function under the NEC Hong Kong edition as it does under NEC4 TSC. We have a set of user guides. Volume 1 and Volume 3 are generic and cover all contracts within the NEC suite. Volume 1 is about establishing your contract strategy and giving guidance on issues related to procurement. Volume 3 relates to how to select a supplier or guidance on tendering. And for the Hong Kong edition, we have a specific Volume 2 in terms of how to prepare the Hong Kong edition of the Term Service Contract, and a Volume 4 in terms of how to manage the Hong Kong edition of the Term Service Contract. Structure of the contract remains the same, and hopefully people will be familiar with the core clauses. So there are 9 sections to the core clauses, and in the TSC there are 3 main option clauses, option A, C and D. And we're going to go through in a minute the specific changes to the core clauses and the main option clauses. In terms of secondary option clauses and the dispute clauses, standard NEC4 TSC dispute clauses have been removed, so that would be W1 and W2, and they've been replaced with W4. And so that's a new clause. In principle, W4 is exactly the same as option W4 in the ECC Hong Kong edition, but we'll talk about that in a little while. In terms of secondary option clauses, you can see X9 is a new clause that's been introduced. So this is to do with the transfer of rights to do with design material. X14, advance payment to the contractor, has been brought into the TSC Hong Kong edition. And X15, to do with liabilities and issues to do with where the contractor is doing design. And we'll talk in a little bit more detail about those new secondary option clauses in a minute. Lastly, we've got a new secondary option clause, X30, Innovation and Technology. And again, a bit like W4, this is the same clause or the equivalent clause that exists in the ECC Hong Kong edition. The table just identifies where in the contract we have made changes. And specifically on these slides, where it's marked in red, these are related to the task order enhancements. So there's been a variety of changes through the contract related to enhancing the task order provisions. You can see here that quite a few changes have been made in terms of section 7 of the contract, and all these relate to enhancing the task order provisions. And the introduction of X9, X14 and X15 all relate to enhancing the task order provisions and providing greater flexibility in terms of how we use task orders. I'm now going to talk through what changes we've made in relation to task orders. So the idea here with the changes around task orders is to allow the client to use task orders as a way of calling off work and effectively doing a number of mini projects through the term of the contract. So this is sort of using the contract in a slightly different way. Rather than providing the service over a term, this is to allow a client to do mini construction projects through the use of the task order provisions. So in thinking about that, we've created the concept of having a task order site. And the task order site sits within the affected property. And whenever we issue a task order, as part of that task order, we define the extent or the boundaries of the task order site. There is flexibility in that if the site is outside of the affected property, we can extend the affected property to include the task order site. In defining the extent of the site within the task order, there's also flexibility to provide any additional information describing the site and its surroundings that may be relevant to what we're asking the contractor to do, part of the task order. So this information is the equivalent of what is called site information in the ECC. There may already, of course, be some of that information within the contract. That would be information describing the affected property. So that would form part of the affected property information. But depending on the task order, there may be further information that we want to add to that in terms of describing the existing conditions of the site and its surroundings. We've also tweaked the provisions around delay damages insofar as what the delay damages are would now be stated in contract data as opposed to being stated in the task order. NEC4 TSC already had a task order program in along with the contractor's plan. We still have a task order program. We've just created a little bit more flexibility in terms of how quickly the task order program is submitted. And as you can see in the first bullet, it's either submitted within the period stated in contract data, or if there is a different period stated in the task order within that different period. We've amended the response period to the task order program. It used to be 1 week. We've changed it to 2 weeks. So that's the same as the ECC response period. We've introduced the provision around prevention. So this didn't exist in the term service contract, but we've introduced it into the term service Hong Kong edition. So this is prevention with regard to a task order. And the provisions are the equivalent of the ECC Hong Kong edition, clause 19.1. Simplistically, this is about a force majeure event occurring that the parties could not have foreseen, and it provides for how parties then manage and seek to mitigate the effects of that event. there's been some enhancements around defects and related to tasks. And so we've introduced this thing called the performance review period. This is the equivalent to the period between completion and the defects date in the ECC contract. And the intention here is for this period, it starts once a task is complete and runs for a period of time, perhaps say 6 months. It's an identified term, so we define what that period is within contract data. So it's flexible for each contract, but perhaps it's 6 months. And during that period, we are monitoring the work that was done under the task order. And as and when defects arise during that performance review period, there are then obligations around how those defects are dealt with. Once the performance review period ends, the intention is that any defects, we wouldn't keep on looking at defects for that particular task because we might have moved on to doing other tasks under the contract. Depending on the timing of when a task is instructed and hence when the task starts and when it completes, if the performance review period for a particular task runs over the end of the service period, then we have a provision that allows the service period to be extended to the end of that performance review period. But during that extended period, we can't issue any further tasks or instruct any other works or services. Other enhancements around defects related to tasks. We've brought in the provision around searching for a defect. So this is a provision that's been brought in from the ECC. So the service manager can instruct the contractor to search for a task defect until 4 weeks before the end of the performance review period. Why 4 weeks? This just gives the parties time between when the last search can be made and if a defect is found to resolve that defect before the end of the performance review period. In terms of any task-related defects, we have included provisions around how quickly they should be corrected. And we can see here that there's an overriding obligation to correct them within a time that minimizes the adverse effect on the client. Notwithstanding that, we want them corrected before the end of the performance review period, or if a defect is notified at the end of the performance review period, corrected within 4 weeks of the end of the performance review period. So this tries to limit how long tasks may be left, and it includes provisions around how quickly the contractor should correct the defects, minimize the effects of them. In that respect, similar to the ECC and the defect certificate, at the end of a performance review period, or if there's uncorrected tasks within 4 weeks of the end of the performance review period, the service manager issues a notification to the contractor setting out the status of any task-related defects. So this would be very similar to the defect certificate under the ECC. And the notification would either record that there are no uncorrected defects, or it would record what defects exist and have not yet been corrected. In terms of compensation events, we've brought across a number of compensation events from the ECC, and these generally relate to sort of time-related risks or risks that could impact upon the timing of how quickly a task is completed. So, for example, if the client or others are carrying out work within the site that the contractor didn't know about, and that adversely affects the timing of the works or services being done under the task, we have a compensation event that covers that. So that's 60.1 bracket 6. We've also brought in ones to do with finding an object of value or historical or other interest within the site, the unforeseen physical conditions being found within the site, or the weather conditions. The weather conditions clause is the equivalent clause to the ECC Hong Kong version of weather conditions. And recognising that the price list may include quantities, brought in the provision around if the quantities turn out to be a lot more and hence take more time to deal with. That would or could potentially affect how quickly task completion could be achieved, and hence that's a compensation event. A number of provisions have been brought in related to Section 7 of the contract. This is to do with title. So you can see that we've brought in the provisions around marking, equipment, plant and materials. Those provisions, the equivalent of what we have in the ECC Hong Kong edition. So that's clause 70.1 and 71.1. It's to do with marking equipment that is outside of the site or the service area. Similarly, we brought in the equivalent clause or provision around removing equipment from site. We've got provisions with regard to the title over material from the excavation or demolition within the site and the use of material by the client. Other provisions related to task orders. So we've made a small change within Section 8 of the contract. So this is to do with insurances to cover off loss of or damage to work within the task. X9 has been brought over from the ECC Hong Kong edition, and this is to do with transfer of rights over design material. So this is if, as part of a task, a contractor is being instructed to do some design of what they're going to build, this deals with the rights over that design. We've introduced flexibility within the contract around advance payment to do with tasks. So this is only to do with tasks. So this X14, it's the equivalent of the ECC Hong Kong edition, where depending on the restrictions, so there's a number of restrictions within the clause. So under certain circumstances, the contractor can request an advance payment. And if they want to do that, they submit what's called an advance payment statement, which sets out the sum of money to be paid up front. And then in terms of repaying that sum, it's then repaid as we move through from the starting date of the task through to completion. And again, we've got flexibility here to deal with depending on how long it takes to complete a task. We state a period in contract data, so that's sort of a default period if you like. But if planned task completion is sooner than that period finishing, then repayment is made by the earlier date. Much like with X9, X15 has been brought over from the ECC Hong Kong edition. And this is to do with if we're asking the contractor to do design as part of the task, perhaps designing the work they're going to do within the task. So X15 deals with a number of issues related to design. So reasonable skill and care liability, contractor's use of the design information, retention of the design information, and professional indemnity insurance requirements. And lastly, to align with the provision around the title around material from excavation and demolition, we've included the equivalent provisions within the schedule of cost components to cover the cost of it. So they were the enhancements related to task order provisions. I'm just going to now run through the other changes to the TSC Hong Kong edition when compared to the NEC4 TSC. So all of these changes essentially are the same as what has been changed within the ECC Hong Kong edition. So we've introduced a number of new defined terms to do with local legislation issues. So for example, the Code on Access to Information and the Public Accounts Committee. We've introduced a new defined term related to tier subcontractors. So this covers the first 3 tiers of subcontracting. We've amended some defined terms to reflect other changes in the contract and specifically provisions related to W4. TSC Hong Kong edition clause 12.5 is a new clause that deals with third-party rights. Clause 18 deals with corrupt acts, and some changes have been made to this to bring in local legislation provisions. So the definition or the scope of what a corrupt act is has been changed to align with the Prevention of Bribery Ordinance. Tier subcontractors have now been expressly referenced within Clause 18 provisions, and there are obligations with regard to notifying the client and the ICAC as soon as somebody becomes aware of a corrupt act occurring. The subcontract provisions now relate to all three first tiers of subcontracting. Clause 26 provisions with regard to assignment have been amended such that the contractor needs to obtain the client's agreement before transferring the benefit or any rights under this contract. And the disclosure provisions in Clause 27 have been enhanced and applied to tier subcontractors, and circumstances when the client can disclose information have been expressly stated, and that's a new Clause 27.2. In terms of payment, the payment provisions, a couple of changes have been made here. In terms of timing of when a payment application is submitted, it now needs to be submitted 2 weeks before the assessment date to give the service manager more time to process it. And what we're assessing has also been changed in terms of forecasting what will have been paid 1 week after the next assessment date rather than by the next assessment date. The timing of the payment certificate has changed and is now within 2 weeks of the assessment date rather than 1 week, and payment is subject to the client's right of offset. Has been introduced into 51.1, and interest is now calculated on a simple interest basis. The process for undertaking the final assessment has been changed, and this aligns with how we've changed the ECC Hong Kong edition. So the contractor is required to submit a final application for payment, and the timing of that depends on the circumstances, whether that's at the end of the service period or if termination has occurred. Once received, the service manager makes an assessment and certifies a final payment within 4 weeks, and then the final payment is made within one of those timescales after the payment is certified. We have a compensation event around shortage of labour, so this is an equivalent event that's been brought over from the ECC Hong Kong edition. In terms of other matters related to compensation events or the assessment of compensation events and defined cost, under option A, we've removed the provisions around people rates. So again, this is a change that's been made in the ECC Hong Kong edition. So we're assessing the cost of people based on their actual or real cost. In terms of Section 8 of the contract, there have been a couple of changes there. So we've removed strikes from Clause 80.1. So the default is strike would be a contractor liability. Under 81.1, we've introduced a liability related to loss of damage to work in a task. This is something the contractor needs to manage. And we've introduced flexibility such that additional contractor liabilities can be stated in contract data. In terms of recovery of cost, there's a provision, and again, this is the same as the ECC Hong Kong edition, where the client has a right to recover sums from the contractor for which the contractor is liable to the client under other contracts with the client. One of the main changes with regard to insurance is relocating the insurance table from core clauses to contract data. And this allows or provides greater flexibility in what insurances are required, who provides them, and what sum is being insured without having to amend the contract. And also related to insurance, we've introduced or referred to tier subcontractors. A couple of changes under termination. So there's a new clause 90.5, and again with regard to corrupt acts, tier subcontractors are expressly referenced within clause 91.7. In terms of dispute avoidance and management, we have a new option W4 clause, and this is the equivalent to what is in ECC Hong Kong edition, and this provides for an escalation process in terms of resolving any disputes that may arise. It also recognises that payment disputes may be dealt with slightly differently, and in so doing recognises the security of payment provisions. So a dispute can include a payment dispute, but we've carved out payment disputes as a separate provision. So if a dispute arises, in the first instance, it would be referred to service manager, but the contractor has the option, if the dispute is a payment dispute, to refer it to the adjudicator in accordance with the security of payment provisions. And if they have referred it to the adjudicator, then they would not refer it to the service manager. The service manager is required to make a decision within 4 weeks and notify the parties accordingly. The adjudicator would respond within the timescales in accordance with the security of payment provisions. If a party is dissatisfied with the decision, whether it's from the service manager or the adjudicator, if it's a payment dispute, then the next step in the escalation process would be to refer it to mediation. And that would be done in accordance with mediation rules that are identified in contract data. Depending on the outcome of the mediation or progress with mediation, final step would be to refer the matter to arbitration. And that would be done in accordance with the arbitration rules. Changes to secondary option clauses that we haven't already covered. So X1, price adjustment for inflation. We've introduced the concept of having an index figure that's stated in contract data. The table of proportions in contract data part 1 is replaced by the schedule of proportions, which is to be provided by the contractor and hence is referenced in contract data part 2. In terms of making any calculation, if the index figure does change after the calculation is made in terms of a payment, then it would be corrected in the next assessment. X2 has been changed, and we now have flexibility in defining the scope of what a change in law is. We refer to a list of enactments that are identified in contract data. So the scope of the compensation event would only relate to a change in one of the enactments listed in contract data. New clause X30, innovation and technology. So this clause is intended to encourage the parties to make changes in relation to safety, supervision efficiency, or decarbonisation. It's intended to be a collaborative process. It works in a similar way to the early warning process, insofar as either party proposes changes that would enhance safety, supervision efficiency, or decarbonisation. The parties meet to discuss those changes and discuss who's going to do what in terms of implementing them, or if indeed they want to implement them. But assuming we want to go ahead with the change and everybody's minded to do this, the discussions within the meetings, much like discussions within an early warning meeting, are recorded in the register, in this case the INT register. So the INT register is our management tool for recording what the issue is, whether we're going to do something about it, and who's going to do what going forwards in terms of managing the issue. If the proposal is going to be adopted and requires a change to the scope, then the service manager will need to instruct that change. And depending on the circumstances, this would lead to a compensation event. In terms of the schedule of cost components, certain pension costs are now excluded, and I've already mentioned about removing the provisions around people rates. In terms of section 2 of the schedule, various amendments have been made in relation to removing provisions around tendered rates for equipment, and consequently, in terms of determining cost, it would be based on actual or sort of the real cost of the equipment being used. Certain charges are specifically excluded under section 5 of schedule of cost components, and a new clause has been introduced relating to section 7 of the contract about removing and disposing of material from excavation or demolition within the site. Cost of accommodation is also included under the charges. And so that's the equivalent to ECC Hong Kong edition. Under sections 6 and 7 of the schedule, so this is manufacturing and fabrication and design, much like with equipment, provisions around tender rates have been removed. So the costs are going to be based on the actual or real cost of doing any manufacturing or any design. As with the ECC Hong Kong edition, we have a new section 9 that brings in the cost of any insurance premiums are now part of defined cost as opposed to being part of the fee percentage. And lastly, in terms of contract data, various changes have been made within contract data, either removing entries or adding in additional entries to reflect the various changes to the conditions of contract that I've set out today. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.